For 800 years, Rome stood alone, pristine and unconquered, the pinnacle of Western civilization. When it was sacked by Vandals in 410 AD, it marked the end of an empire. But it wasn't the first time the great city had been brought to its knees. At the very dawn of the Republic in the 4th century BC, Romans learned a hard lesson they would keep with them till the end of their days. Never underestimate a barbarian. In the 100 years since Rome had thrown off its last Etruscan king, the Republic had never known a day's peace. And now in 404 BC, it found itself surrounded by enemy city-states, locked in endless wars to gain control over the Tiber River Valley. It was a time of constant wars, but some men found opportunity in the conflict, and Marcus Furius Camillus was fast becoming one of Rome's most promising soldiers. Camillus came from one of the founding dynasties of Rome, which gave him the right to serve as an equites, one of the 300 cavalry assigned to a Roman legion. And it didn't take long for him to distinguish himself. At a battle against the combined forces of the Equi and Volsci, the Roman infantry found themselves outnumbered and outmatched. Eager to prove his worth, Camillus spurred his horse and charged directly into the fight. The Etruscan response came in a hail of javelins. Camillus was pinned to his saddle, struck through the thigh. With the charge faltering, the other equites turned away, leaving the Roman infantry to their fate. But Camillus spurred on, a javelin still jutting from his leg, and crashed headlong into the enemy line. The Etruscans were terrified at the sight of a man so bent on victory, and the center of the army was put to flight. With a single selfless charge, Camillus had gained victory over overwhelming odds. For his exploits, he was given a true Roman honor, his first political office, the censor, in charge of all the finances of the state. A glorified accountant may not sound very exciting today, but in the Republican period, it put him on the path to greatness. But after years of military campaigns, Rome's finances were near non-existent. In the 5th century BC, hunger and poverty stalked the streets of Rome, and the city itself was split to the core between two powerful factions, so that unrest inside the city posed an even greater threat than its unruly neighbors. Camillus waded in with his usual gusto, but the recent wars had left the city awash in orphans and widows. And though they were honored by the citizens for their sacrifice, they were still a drain and a burden on the city. And most importantly, they were exempt from all taxes. Knowing he could do nothing to stop the wars or prevent men from dying, Camillus instead encouraged the living to do their civic duty and marry into these forgotten families. After all, it was believed in the period that any woman who was left untended for too long might become physically ill and needed regular sexual activity to prevent this. Many young men gladly took up the burden, and those that didn't were strong-armed into the marriages through taxation and outright threats. Camillus's radical solution was a success, but he was returned to the front lines before he could propose any more creative solutions to Rome's problems. The war for control of central Italy was still ongoing, and with legions away, raiding parties plundered deep into the Roman countryside, and a strong leader would be needed to push them back. Camillus was happy to oblige. But the Roman way of war was changing. For centuries, legions had spent short campaigns abroad in the summer and then returned home for winter. But with little new territory to show for their efforts, the tribunes decided to employ Rome's true specialty. Forts were put up deep in enemy territory to wage war year-round. If they couldn't take cities by force, then they would starve them into submission. But the neighboring city of Veii had been under Roman siege for nearly 10 years. And with raiders threatening Rome's doorstep again, both time and money had run out. So the Senate played their ace card. Camillus was appointed dictator. When we think of the word today, it's always negative. But to the Romans, it was an emergency failsafe. Dictators were appointed for a specific purpose and given a year to complete their task, but in pursuit of that goal, their power was near absolute. He beat back the allies of Veii and turned his attention to the city itself. And when he saw that the walls were indeed unassailable, well, he wasn't afraid to come up with a new idea and get his hands dirty. He ordered mines dug under the walls, but instead of finding soft dirt, his engineers instead found the city's sewage system. Realizing the opportunity, Camillus ordered an immediate attack on all sides of the citadel. The legions attacked with a ferocity that shocked the Veii, who rushed to their walls to repel them. But it was only a distraction. Camillus had needed to draw the Veii to the walls so they wouldn't notice when he sent a special force down the tunnels to infiltrate the city. Occupied with the assault, no one was watching when the Romans emerged in the city center. To celebrate Camillus's victory, Rome held a triumph in his honor, unlike any before or since in Roman history, with 4 white horses drawing his chariot, an honor reserved for the god Jupiter himself. Camillus used his newfound fame to help establish himself in Rome. He married, started a family, and assumed his position in the Roman Senate. But not everyone was happy with Camillus's success. The Roma of his time was split between the plebeians and patricians. Patricians were families like Camillus's that could trace their lineage back to the original 100 senators appointed by Romulus himself, literal patres, founding fathers. This select group of aristocrats wielded huge political power and barred plebeians from top political offices, religious ceremonies, and even had separate laws just to oppress them. And anytime you have a disenfranchised majority, trouble follows. The leaders of the plebeians had come up with a plan. If they couldn't have full rights in Rome, well then sod it, they'd start their own city. And with Veii newly vacated, they proposed a law that would allow all plebeians to leave Rome and resettle in a new home, taking half of the Roman population with them. The only thing that stopped the crisis was pure luck. The Faliscans were once again raiding Roman lands. Camillus hastily put together his largely plebeian army and marched to besiege the city of Falerii, changing the conversation from one of separation to unity in conflict. But Falerii, like Veii before it, had very high walls. All he could do was surround the city, set up camp, and hold the plebeians there until the political climate changed. So the Falerii posted guards on their walls and then went about their lives with barely even a hiccup. Citizens continued their trades, went to market, and even sent their children to school. Camillus's victory instead comes in the most unlikely way. Falerii, like the Greeks, employed a teacher for the sons of the city's most prominent families. And every day, this teacher would take the boys out beyond the city walls and actually exercise them in the fields, making sure to stop and taunt the Romans, because this was the most useless pretense of a siege ever. Every day, the teacher took the boys further and further from the walls and closer to Roman lines, until one day he walked them directly into the Roman camp and shut the gates behind them. Now, if you're wondering why a Falerian teacher would betray his own city, it's important to remember that most people in trades during this period, doctors, nurses, teachers, were actually slaves. And Rome, unlike Falerii, was known to free slaves and give them full citizenships. But if the teacher walked into Camillus's tent expecting a thank you, he was rudely disappointed. To paraphrase the words of Camillus, even war has certain laws brave and good men respect. He tore off the man's clothes, tied his arms behind his back, and gave rods and whips to the boys that had trusted him with their lives. He then had the boys drive the teacher back to the city gate, beating him the whole way. Camillus had let the sons of the city leaders go free. He had put righteousness above victory. And now it was only a matter of time before he was relieved from his command. Rome had no use for a general with moral scruples. That same night, the people of Falerii held an assembly in the city center and agreed to send envoys to the Roman camp. When they were brought before Camillus, they offered an unconditional surrender. Any man who would treat hostages with such honor was worth entrusting their lives to. Camillus stood from his chair and looked down on the Falerian ambassador. He demanded that they declare friendship to Rome, and then disembarked his army and left them in peace. The plebeian mob in Rome was furious. No plunder, no treasures. The gold from Falerii could have financed campaigns for years to come. And the plebeian soldiers of the army felt robbed of their plunder, which they saw as their due pay. So the tribune of the plebs once again asked to divide the city. This time, there was no avoiding it. The time had come to put the proposal to a vote. As one of the city's leaders, Camillus was put in an impossible position. He knew that Rome's armies were nothing without its plebeian soldiers, and that if the city divided its manpower in half, neither could stand up to its enemies. Braving public scorn, he declared that he would not support the law. The other senators listened to his counsel, and the law failed. Cries of anger and betrayal ripped through the city. Camillus had made himself plebeian enemy number one. Camillus had no choice but to quit public life, retreat back to his villa, and close his doors on the city he loved. But the plebs wanted blood. Within days, he was accused of embezzling the treasures of Falerii for himself, and would be forced to stand trial for the offense. But the fates felt that even this wasn't enough for Camillus. Locked away inside of his villa, he watched as his firstborn son, his heir, succumb to illness and die in his arms. Racked with sorrow at the death of both of his families, Camillus begged his friends to help him avoid the shame of a public trial and imprisonment. But fearing retribution from the plebs, they instead agreed to pay the fine, an obscene amount chosen specifically to leave Camillus destitute. But first, Camillus would have to plead guilty to the charges. Seething with the fury of his namesake, Camillus declared that he would not bear that shame. He instead chose exile, turning his back on his home as they had on him. And as he led his wife and remaining son through Rome's gates for the last times, he turned back to the Capitoline Hill and prayed to the gods that Rome might be reminded why it needed Marcus Furius Camillus. And somewhere in the darkness, the gods listened. Join me next time as Camillus' wrath takes the shape of a man and forever changes Rome. If you enjoyed this, make sure to click subscribe to be notified when part 2 comes out. And maybe check out some of the other videos on my channel. And as always, thanks for watching.